Losing your spouse, your husband, can feel like your brain just goes into chaos. The emotions are not just normal grief. Maybe you've looked up some grief theories and you're like, this is not how I feel. Maybe it's very confusing. What is going on in my mind? There's so many emotions whirling around. It's not just grief. A partner relationship is often complicated. So losing that partner, that person that you have said you are going to spend your life with, has lots of chaos around it. It's not just the love and the care and the missing of that person, but what they provided for you in a physical, mental, emotional stability mindset. So what do I know about that? I too have lost my husband. And although every loss of a spouse is a different story, I have experienced every type of grief. I lost my son in a drowning accident in 2005. Bam, completely healthy, one day there, one day gone. I lost another son in 2016 after 10 years of medical trauma. So I had that anticipatory grief, that fear of loss, and then losing him. I also lost my daughter to sudden unexpected death and epilepsy, where she just died in her sleep. My son Reggie, my daughter Maya, and my husband, we call him Bundy, all had a rare neurodegenerative condition called DRPLA. And my husband went on to hospice and lost him just this year. And so I have experienced anticipatory grief, sudden grief, traumatic grief. And I can tell you, they all feel different, but one thing is the same. It feels like a mindfuck, like your brain just goes, ah. So what can we do about that? I teach something called the Mentally Strong Method. If you're interested in more information about that, click the link below, give us your email address. We'll give you a free ebook. You can kind of start to learn how to think through your problems, organize them, and make decisions in line with what you want. But what do you want? After losing the person that you committed to spending your life with, you're confused. You don't necessarily know what you want. So in the Mentally Strong Method, we start with what I call a thought map. And it's basically just mind mapping this chaos that's going on in your brain. And it allows you to get hours of journaling down in just minutes and really kind of knowing what are all the contributing factors. So I'm just going to walk you through my little thought map that I did this morning as I was preparing for this video. And I started with the feeling of alone. Now, maybe that's not your feeling. Get out a piece of paper. Let's do this together. I want you to write down how you feel right now. Maybe you feel angry. Maybe you feel depressed. Maybe you feel overwhelmed. Just write that word down. But mine today was the word alone. And you ask yourself, what makes me feel alone? And obviously, losing my husband makes me feel alone. But I wrote here hospice because it was a period of a long time that we knew my husband was going to die. And maybe that was the case for you. Or maybe you had a sudden death like when I lost Maya in 2021 or Johnny in the drowning accident. So your thought map is not going to look anything like mine. This is just to give you a visual of what I'm saying. So you write down your main thought, and then I wrote down hospice because the word hospice just encompassed the whole loss, right? It was a gift that I got to say goodbye, but it was also an acknowledgement that at the end of my husband's life was hard. It was hard to take care of him, that I already felt emotionally alone. There was almost some relief in his passing, and then guilt for feeling that relief. Can you relate? Or maybe yours was traumatic and sudden. But I just want you to take your word and tell me, write down in bubbles, what makes you feel that way right now. And then I wrote down, like, what's made me feel alone in the past? And for me, when I asked myself that question, guilt rose to the surface because I believe that my husband was an answer to my prayers and that he loved me unconditionally. He was a family man. He was loyal, good person. Everybody loved Bundy. But maybe that's not your story. Maybe, and this is why I talk about this mind chaos, right? In that maybe there was some complications and complexities of your relationship that are contributing to the chaos of the grief, right? And for mine, it was the hospice, that it was difficult, that there was some relief. But maybe yours is your story, and maybe it's very private. Maybe your kids don't even know some of the negative feelings or thoughts or realities that you have about your spouse, and then the guilt that you feel now that they're gone. Just get it down in these little bubbles, not full sentences. You know what it means. And then the next question is, when did you feel like that as a child? This doesn't have to do with your relationship with your spouse. And for me, I felt very alone without a partner. And that's why I said, I thought that I would be whole if I found a partner. And I did find a partner. It was an answer to a prayer, and we were married for 26 years. But if you've been married as long as I have, you know that that's not all a romantic comedy, right? And in the end, for me, the reality of DRPLA in my life, taking 2 of my children and then my husband, the weight of that contributes to the chaos. What is that story for you? If your word was anger or depression or overwhelm, can you remember the first time in your childhood that you felt that way? Because the reality is how we show up in the world and respond in the world often comes in patterns. And the reason we ask these questions is to identify those patterns so that we can work on ourselves. The ultimate thing in this video is learning self-care. But how can you learn self-care if you don't even know what all this is and why? So if you've asked yourself 3 questions. What makes me feel like this now? What's made me feel like this in the past? And when's the first time or in my childhood did I feel like this? Then the last question, and I know any one of those questions could go for hours, right? But really just put down the first things that come to your mind, because we're looking for patterns here and looking to identify things so that we can organize this chaos. The last question is, how does this impact my spiritual relationship? For me, I told you that I felt like my husband was an answer to prayer, that I prayed for a partner, a life partner that would love me unconditionally and be loyal and want to have a family with me. And God answered that. And so when I ask myself that question, it's like, I think of this thing that people say, God gives and takes away. God gives and takes away. Is that a positive statement? Is that just being tragically realistic? Either way, it's a spiritual conflict. Because if God is love and loves me unconditionally and wants to protect me, then God loves and God gives and takes away would not be an accurate description, right? And this is not a God video. This is not about, it is about, and I always ask this spiritual question for a very specific reason. In the fear of me telling you what you should believe spiritually, people are not talking about their spiritual health. And to process grief, we have to acknowledge our spiritual selves, the eternal nature of our soul. And so, yes, I ask the question. I believe in God. I reference God often. But the question for you is, how does this impact your spiritual relationship? And if you aggressively say, I don't believe in God, then there's some spiritual conflict there, right? And I'm not saying you have to believe in God, but you are a spiritual being as well as a physical, mental, and emotional being. And that is causing some chaos. That is contributing to the chaos. And that's why I asked the question. So now that you have kind of written all those things down and all of these bubbles, it represents the chaos that's going on in your mind. And now we have to organize that. And so in the Mentally Strong Method, and that's a whole 8-hour course, but I'll just, kind of give you a glimpse of like what is going on here for me. Obviously grief. Mine is compounded grief, and maybe yours is too. Maybe, you've lost your spouse, but you also lost your father or lost someone else. And for me, it was cumulative grief. I lost 3 children, 2 to the same disorder that took my husband, right? Like just hit after hit. And so grief is its own category, but trauma is also its own category. And it's very important. This chaos is because grief and trauma enmesh with everything else going on in your brain. It enmeshes, right? Just so think of a knotted ball of yarn, like it's just all knotted up because life and all of the things surrounding it have just gotten chaotic. And when we have grief and trauma, it just enmeshes with all of that. It enmeshes with our negative self-talk. It enmeshes with our anxiety. It enmeshes with our behaviors and choices. It enmeshes with our spiritual conflict. Oftentimes people get into addiction as a coping. Like that ball of yarn that's all knotted up, you need to take it apart and put the things in their categories. So we put the grief in the grief category. So, in grief, we talk about how we miss that person as a person. I miss that everybody loved Bundy. We couldn't go anywhere without him making a friend. I miss that he was so gregarious. I miss that he loved me so much. No one will ever love me like that man loved me. But what I don't put in the grief box is the trauma, the ugliness, the things that happened to him at the end of his days. I don't put the negative feelings that I had towards him and Derpla. That goes in the trauma box. DRPLA, this rare neurodegenerative condition, ruined our family, took 2 of my kids and my husband. That goes in the trauma. That's not grief. That's trauma. And that needs to be processed differently because the grief of losing my husband is going to be cherished forever. That is my pain. I love him. He loved me. The trauma, we are going to process and get rid of it. Let it go. But when you can see how when grief and trauma are meshed together, that you want to hold on to the trauma. And that's not healthy. That's what's causing the chaos. And there's more components of that. The anxiety, fear of being alone. I'm fine being alone. For me, I was always financially contributor and often made more than my husband. And so it's not so much of a fear of being taken care of. It's a fear of being alone. And what does that mean for me? It means if I'm alone, nobody loves me. And then the spiritual conflict, right? Of this God gives and takes away. What kind of person does that? So does God even love me? But you got to put the spiritual conflict in its own category because that is worked out through meditation and prayer. And the grief is worked out with taking the time to cherish and feel that pain. Trauma is processed somatically, like get it out of our body. Maybe your anxiety, maybe there's a lot of physical things, tangible things that your husband or spouse did for you. Maybe they paid all the bills. Maybe you did not contribute significantly to the family finances. Maybe they died without a will. Maybe there was nothing left. Those are all complications. That's not your grief. That gets enmeshed with your grief. And that's traumatic right now. If you're going through that right now, that's traumatic right now. Put that in the trauma box. Behaviors and choices. What are you going to do about that? The reason we put these things in little boxes is because we can make like one decision to do. Remember that ball of yarn that's all knotted up? Can we get one thing out of there? Can we loosen those knots? Taking that as the picture, wherever you are, whatever that chaos is, what can you organize? What can you put? And if you're in the midst of trauma, so like I said, if you just lost your spouse and everything is falling apart, you don't have time to, work through some of these other categories. What you need to do is in behaviors and choices, what can you do right now to get out of the trauma? You can't heal from trauma until you're safe from it. So the priority becomes, if you're in the middle of trauma, the priority becomes getting out of the trauma. How can I take care of myself physically first, right? And then mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. So I got a couple questions from people who have lost their husband. The first question is, I am so angry at my husband and at God. I don't even know where to start. And some backstory on this person. Her husband passed away doing things that hurt her. So you remember I talked about the complicatedness, and we have to learn self-care. And I can tell you, and I know you don't want to hear this right now, but anger is always a secondary emotion. It's a protective. We put anger up like a forest field around us because we can't feel what's under there. And so your first step when you have this overwhelming anger is to start chipping away at the anger. Now, sometimes I do things like, punching a punching bag. Maybe you take your little thought map that you did and rip it up into pieces and burn it, or something symbolic to release some of the anger and just try to figure out underneath. I mean, it's probably hurt, betrayal, which is hard. I mean, I talk about divorce as a type of grief, right? And it's almost worse than death, right? Because it's you lost that person to betrayal. And I'm sorry that you are dealing with both betrayal and grief by loss. But that first step is getting through the anger layer to find out what's underneath. Next question. My husband was the love of my life, and I don't think that I can live without him. Well, that's a negative thought, and I want to challenge you. Saying that you can't do something, you won't be able to do it. So your first step, if we were to be doing the Mentally Strong method, negative thoughts is also a category in there. And I would have you put in the I can't as your negative thought. And then I would ask you, honestly, on a scale of 0 to 10, 10 truly believing that you can't, and 0 meaning you can live without him, what number are you? And I can imagine even in your worst feelings, you would probably say an 8 or 9. I'm not asking you to go to 0. I'm asking you to take that a couple notches. And it's like, if you think about this, this scale of 0 to 10, and you give me 10% area that you believe in yourself, I would say, how do we feed that 10%? How do we feed that so that it becomes 20% and 30% and eventually more than 60%, right? Once you're at more than 60%, I catch myself, I've been working on myself for years, and I catch myself saying I can't. And I know I can. I can do anything I put my mind to. I have been through the worst. I can. Last question, kind of on a hopeful. It's been 5 years since my spouse passed away, and I've worked through a lot of things, and I feel good and want to get into another relationship. Well, if that's what you want, I want you to put that in your behaviors and choices. I want you to put that in your personal vision and begin to think about how that happens. Okay, I'm not a relationship expert. I am not in that place. And it honestly looks a little complicated at my age to be looking. But just the fact that you said, I want, that is not to be ignored. I can tell you, after my daughter died, before my husband passed away, but he was already known to be heading in that direction, I was turning 50, and I spent the year trying to figure out who I am. What is self-care? Everybody says, oh, you got to go take care of yourself. And, the things that people would say didn't actually fill my cup. And so I spent a year figuring out who am I and what actually fills my cup. So that's my challenge to you. To first figure out who am I, what fills my cup, and what would I be looking for in a partner? Because what I am an expert on is that self-development, self-care. Watch my video on self-care, which goes into a series on how to take care of yourself in multiple ways. Keep on that journey of mental strength.